with teams for matches in heat and or at altitude. So I'm going to go through four main topics within this lecture. So first of all, we're going to look at the altitude effect on physiology and performance. Then we're going to look at the practical strategies that can be used by teams when they travel and to avoid the negative effects of altitude. Then we're going to talk about more or less the same, but talking about heat. So what are the physiological effects of heat on physiology and performance? And again, what are the strategies that can be used to minimize the negative effect on performance? So when it comes to discuss about the effect of heat of hypoxia, before going really into details, I'd like to classify the acute and the chronic responses to the exposure of these two stressors. So first of all, on the acute side, obviously exposure to heat and hypoxia leads to an increase in cardiovascular stress, thermoregulatory stress as well, especially with heat, an increase in metabolic cost of exercise, and an increase in partial responses. These responses appear for a given external workload, which means that we have an increase in the internal versus external cost, which can be used for rehabilitation, metabolic post-session top-ups, for example, or full flush recovery. The interest of that is that for same and could be a low neuromuscular mechanical work, we have an increased metabolic demand, which is pretty interesting in this concept. But that's not something we're going to talk much today. We're going to focus more on the chronic adaptations and the acclimatization strategies that we need to go through when we want to compete at altitude. So just to be a bit more precise, there are two terms used in the literature, which refers to acclimatization. That means when a team actually travels and spends some time and adapts to these conditions, could be heat or altitude. They just spend some time and they acclimatize themselves to the environment. The other condition is what we call acclimation, which happens when we try to mimic the stress of the environment through, for example, the use of heat chamber or altitude rooms, and we do that in a normal environment, but we just expose the players to some specific constraint to have them to adapt. This acclimation or acclimatization process leads with some time to an improve in cardiovascular fitness, an improve in thermoregulatory capacity, an improve in metabolic regulation, and obviously a better maintenance of perception during exercises. This adaptation to heat can be used either as a proper ergogenic method, as to improve performance as during pre-season camps, as could be done, for example, for very, very specific interventions, or through the process we started to discuss, through the process of acclimation to prepare a game, for example, at altitude or in a hot environment. So I'm going to talk now about the process about preparing a game, but there is a second lecture which is based more on using the ergogenic effect as a way to improve fitness. So let's focus now on the acclimation phases. So I thought it was interesting to start with describing the effects of altitude on physiology and physical performance, and for that I'm going to use mainly a study I was involved, or it was a camp which became a study as well, so it was probably one of the most exciting projects I've been involved with. So it was back in 2012. At this time I was working in Qatar in Aspire, Aspetar, and we kind of helped the Joys, the under-17 Australian national team, to get prepared for I think it was the Asia Cup, and they had to play at altitude. So the Australian Federation organized a camp in La Paz, so 3,600 meters, to prepare as a preparation camp for the national team. And we, as sports scientists and supporting staff, we just followed this team, and we kind of conducted a lot of measurements. And I'm going to use the results of this study to highlight what could be done in practice with your teams. So first of all, it's well known that physiology is affected by altitude immediately, of course, through the decrease in air density. And obviously VO2 max is affected almost linearly as you can see, with the decrease, or the VO2 max decreases with the increase in altitude. So there are kind of some guidelines, and people tend to say that it's only above 1,000 meters or 800 meters that altitude really matters. But if you look at this graph, you can see that there is an effect almost at every single altitude. So that's important to notice. Obviously, the higher the altitude, the greater the decrease in performance. Obviously, the effect of altitude is linked to the performance itself. So if you think about endurance, which is obviously related to VO2 max, altitude will have an important effect. If you just think about speed or power events, like a sprint or a short push, altitude will unlikely have an effect on the metabolic aspect. And as you know, because of the reduced air density, it can even be beneficial sometimes. But within our context of football, which is kind of a mixed in terms of demands between the aerobic side and the speed and power aspect, we're going to have a kind of a mixed effect as well. And it's probably, and yeah, as we'll see, performance will be affected, but not as much as if you were running 1,500 meters, for example. But the effect will be substantial. So just starting on simple aerobic related performance, I'm back talking now about this study with the Australians. So we had a few of them, a few players participating in their regular testing throughout the season before the camp. So you can see on March and April, you can see the performance of the Australian on the Yo-Yo Air 1 test. They were around 2,000 meters. So that was kind of the baseline performance before the camp. Then they traveled in August. We did some performance measure when they were already in Bolivia, but not in La Paz yet. They were at sea level, so they were performing more or less the same as their baseline. And you see now the acute effect. As soon as we landed in La Paz, I think almost in the afternoon, they had to perform the test, and you see a clear, very important decrease at about 25% of decrease in performance during the test. So the acute effect was pretty dramatical. And you see as well that they kind of recovered a little bit, like 9 days after arrival. You see their performance increased a little bit, but they were still not able to recover completely. I'm talking here about the black bars. If you see as well on the white bars, these were actually the Bolivians who were competing against the Australian during this camp. And as you see, they were showing as well this kind of decrement, but it was a little bit less marked just because they were more used to those guys. So the acute performance on the acute effect on the aerobic performance is pretty significant. What about sprinting performance? That was kind of an unexpected findings because as we discussed, because of the reduced air, sometimes sprinting speed can be improved very acutely. But what we observed throughout the development of the camp is that sprinting speed actually decreased, or players got actually slower and slower being exposed to high altitude. So there are very ways to explain that, but it's probably related to the fact that because of the acute effect of their overall health, as we'll see after, they just couldn't maintain the same quality throughout the camp, and they just lost a bit their speed throughout, which is probably not something that we really are looking for. What about now the effect of altitude on RP during training? So as a marker, obviously, of perceived intensity. And again, what is very, very interesting is to look at the difference between the white bars representing the Bolivians used to train at altitude and the black bars representing the Australian we are not used to train at altitude. And as you can see, the difference are massive as soon as they arrive in altitude. So when you look at the blue side of the graph, you see that most of the time they were perceiving the sessions twice harder, the Australian twice harder than the Bolivian. So the effect of training intensity and obviously training load overall is substantial. That means practically, if ever you travel to altitude, train to altitude, make sure you adjust training content or training intensity to maintain an overall manageable training load. If we look now at the running performance during games, again, we have the same pattern as we've seen for the yo-yo test, for example. We have a first game, which is a sea level game. We're just focusing here on the high intensity section, a portion of the game. So the performance is more or less equivalent for Bolivian and Australians. As soon as we arrive in La Paz, you see a massive drop in running performance for the Australians. We are not used to that, while Bolivians, having their history, manage to maintain more or less the running performance. And further on, with the acclimatization process, you see that running performance of the Australian backed up a little bit and went a bit back further. Which is interesting is more to see the time needed. Even in that case, after 13 days at altitude, the Australian could still not match the Bolivian, which shows, and we're going to talk a bit further after, that the acclimatization is a pretty long process. Now, when it comes to just winning games in altitude, it's a pretty interesting graph that shows that the probability of winning decreases almost by 2 when between the team that is used to an altitude and the team that is not used to the altitude. And your chance of winning decreases by 2 when you get a 2,000 meters difference. So that's typically the case of Bolivia when they play teams from sea level. They have a more than twice higher chance of winning just because of the effect of altitude. So now that we discussed the acute effect of altitude on performance overall, what can we do in practice to minimize the detrimental effect of altitude on performance? So we discussed a little bit about acclimation. I think to start to have an idea of the time frame required to really adapt, it's good to see, first of all, how the physiology of players will adapt with the time. So in this pretty overall, but pretty dense but complete graphic from Chris Gore, you see that depending on the system, the biological system, the recovery or the adaptation obviously is different. The ability to adapt his ventilation is more or less done in about 3-4 days. If you look, for example, conversely, if you look at the time that VO2 max adapts, again, you see more than 15 days. If you look at, for example, how hemoglobin mass develops, which is obviously a long-term adaptation that helps the cardiovascular system to carry oxygen, that takes about weeks as well. So depending on the time frames, and also depending on some measures that we monitored with on these Australian players, we could start to give recommendation on the optimal window or at the earliest time of arrival to make sure the acclimatization can occur. So if you look, for example, at the blood saturation resting in the morning, you can see on that graph that obviously the saturation, which is more or less around 80, 89, 88 at rest at sea level, drops immediately around 85 when you are at an altitude such as 3,600 as La Paz. And it took about 7-8 days to start to see an improvement in this saturation in the morning. Obviously, at this altitude, the saturation will never reach back the normal levels, but we could see that a week minimum was needed to see some adaptation when it comes to look at the saturation of the blood. If you look at other measures, so it's a bit more busy slide, but you will see that depending on what we were looking, like the heart rate, resting heart rate variability, or we have also the heart rate response to a submaximal test. All these measures were measured every single day, and most of the time you can see a trend for a return to normal after 9, 10, 11 days. So again, that shows that you need to stay a pretty long time at altitude to get your physiology recover and match and start to rebound to match the pre-travel levels. An important concern as well about altitude, we were just discussing the recovery of the physiological variables and performance. It's well known as well that sleep is often pretty substantially affected at altitude. As you can see on this graph, and especially the REM sleep, which is the bottom right part of the slide. So the REM sleep, which is very important on the mental aspect of the recovery. This REM sleep was very, very much decreased at altitude, and it actually did not even recover. The slower sleep, which is more another part of the sleep that helps to recover physiologically, was also affected, didn't recover. But maybe the magnitude of the decrease was a bit less. But that's why I wanted to discuss this slide, is that the altitude has a profound effect on sleep quality. That means that staying for a while might help to adapt at different levels in terms of physiology and performance, but during this time, players might just have a poor sleep or not efficient sleep. So that may be something that needs to be balanced. So based on that, what are the recommendations we could give? So based on the physiology especially, so the graph of Chris Gore I started with and our measurements with the Australians, so we would recommend to arrive minimum a week, but likely more 2 weeks before the match. I'm not sure this is really feasible, but in theory, that's what would be required from the research. Obviously, once the players arrive at the location, we will have to compensate for the decreased intensity. So that means that because of the altitude, players won't be able to train as hard as they used to. So you might have to find some options to make sure the neuromuscular constraints are kept minimum, so that they don't lose their explosivity, their explosiveness, they don't lose their speed and power. So an option could maybe to start to travel at an altitude which is in between sea level and the altitude of destination, to start to adapt slowly, but not get the overall effect of altitude, keep some quality during training, and then maybe the second week travel to the other altitude. That could be an option. Another option, which is not acclimatization but back to acclimation, will be if you had the options to have players to spend some time in altitude chambers before traveling. But that means exercising in altitude chamber, which is not easy, and obviously the access to this chamber is not easy, and I'll discuss that more in detail into the second talk. Or could be sleeping in altitude dormitories, but again, that's not something very, very common. So there are some limits to that. Obviously, don't forget to adjust the intensity of training overall. That was referring to the slides where we are showing that the RP of the players not used to altitude were just twice greater than that of the other players. So that's important, yeah, to manage the training intensity. After that, play, and obviously there's no need to stay longer and then leave. So again, that's based on physiology and more or less the research findings. I'd like to discuss a bit further the plan and say that most of the time, if teams have to play a very important games at altitude, they might have to organize a preparatory camp. At least that sounds ideal to me. That would mean traveling more or less at the same location as the location of the competition, but traveling ahead, probably a month or 2 months before, and have the opportunity to assess both the efficiency and see which player copes and which does not. Because obviously, and we'll discuss that a bit more in detail after as well, the response to altitude is very individual. Some players have no problem, they adapt well, and some problems struggle. So the idea would be to be able to organize such a camp ahead for about 1 or 2 weeks, look at how players adapt, and based on that, maybe make some recommendation for the competition camp that will come just before competition. But again, that's very theoretical. There are, especially in my experience, in my opinion, many more detrimental effects of altitude that might question the idea of traveling and staying 1 or 2 weeks ahead of the competition. For example, what we observed with these Australians and these Bolivians is that they just had a clear, substantial, gradual, day-by-day decrease in their body mass, which is probably related to many, many factors, but the fact is that they were just losing body mass. And I'm not talking about body water, because obviously there's a lot of dehydration with altitude, but they were just losing mass, losing muscle. So again, on one side, you want to come early to get acclimatized. On the other side, you don't sleep well, you start to lose body mass. And also, there are some very, very difficult moments, especially the first night, as you can see here in terms of Wellness in terms of the Lake Louise score, for example, that we measured as well. The Lake Louise score can be found easily on internet. It's a simple questionnaire to assess the adaptation to altitude. And again, as you see, within the first couple of days, those variables are pretty poor. So that means that you travel, you probably need a few days just to recover from the adaptation to altitude. So think about training properly, think about many things. It's a challenge, just even not talking about training, it's just a challenge to arrive there. If we go a little bit further into the sleep data that I showed you before, you see that especially the four first nights are very poor in terms of total sleep and in terms of sleep efficiency. So again, sleep, wellness, body mass. For a couple of days, players will actually will have difficulties to cope with the altitude. So based on that, practitioners tend to do something which is not complementary in agreement with the official scientific guidelines. They just think, okay, if it's so difficult, first of all, in terms of logistic, to stay 2 weeks to prepare a game, and because we know we're going to struggle for a couple of days, it might be wiser to come just for the game. And we call that the fly-in, fly-out strategy. So in this case, teams will travel near to the location if there is any jet lag to compensate. They will train, prepare the game as close as they can, but at lower altitude, and fly in just the day of the game and arrive a few hours only before the game. In that case, they will not have to sleep in altitude. They will have the least possible detrimental effect of altitude. They will just play the game. Obviously, they won't be acclimatized at all, but the question is probably less acclimatization is still more beneficial than spending a few weeks or a few days at least with all the detrimental effect that we just discussed. So in that case, arriving just before, playing and leaving. In that case, you have some teams flying in, flying out within about 6 hours, 6 to 7 hours, and that's now became common practice in elite teams. So I think that's a good example where sometimes we as practitioners have just to find solutions in terms of costs, benefits, and overall logistic that sometimes do not perfectly agree or match with the science. So now what about during competition? So again, as I said, during competition, there's nothing much to do. Acclimatization in this case hasn't been completed if we take our fly-in, fly-out strategy. But what I have seen, at least anecdotally, as you can see on this picture, you have in that case the Brazilian team who was using additional oxygen, who was breathing gas during halftime at least, which could be probably more a mental aspect than anything else, but that could probably help players to feel better and recover a bit quickly. But knowing that there's no direct link between oxygen availability and recovery of whatsoever in terms of metabolic recovery on a short term, but at least that could help the mental recovery. Apart from that, there's nothing very much available in terms of tools, in terms of food that is different, that should be provided at halftime, for example, in terms of supporting the athletes to recover better. But there's nothing different compared with a game at sea level. So I'm not going to specific details at this point because there's nothing much altitude specific on that case.